technical details. We'll have a Q&A session after the talk. And for that, I would ask you to indicate in the chat box that you want to ask a question or give a comment, so we don't speak all at the same time. And then it's up to you whether you want to unmute yourself and talk, or just put the question in the chat box, and I would then read it out. During the talk, I will automatically mute everyone, so we don't have too much distracting background noises. But as I said, once you want to ask a question, you can easily unmute yourself. And also, as a last thing, I want to make you aware that we are recording this webinar. So if you don't want to appear, please be aware of that. We will make the webinar available on the EADI YouTube channel afterwards, and also on the website, so you can rewatch it or recommend it to others. And after all these introductory talk, I'm happy to introduce today's speaker, which is Professor Peter Knorringa from the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague. He's Professor of Private Development there. And one of his main interests is to investigate to what extent socially responsible and environmentally sustainable forms of development are possible under capitalism. Important question. So he's one of the co-founders and also the present director of the research center Frugal Innovation in Africa. And he's also just recently edited a special issue of the European Journal of Development Research, which has the same title as today's talk on frugal innovation and development. And yeah, without much further ado, I'd like to give the word to you, Peter. Thanks for joining us today.
First unmute so you can hear me. Thank you very much for inviting me to do this. I will put the I can't yet share my screen.
Yes.
Because yours is still on. Yeah. No, I don't see where my screen comes in at the moment.
Right at the bottom.
Yeah, here. And now I can see my own presentation, and I hope that the others can also see it.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. We go to full screen. Okay, yeah, if everybody can see this, then I can start with my introduction. As Julia said, we have the Center for Frugal Innovation in Africa, which is a collaboration between the three universities that you see at the bottom of this first slide. The Leiden University, the Technical University of Delft, and Erasmus University Rotterdam, of which ISS nowadays is a part. And I'm going to talk about the link between frugal innovation and development. Let's see if I can move it to the next slide. Yeah. Okay. I think the first word maybe to say something about is the word frugal, because that often leads to sort of questions about, so what is this? This is yet another word. It's not inclusive. It's not sustainable. So what is frugal? We look at frugality both in consumption and production domains. And frugality is an old and a new concept that is increasingly used now also in development studies. If you think of frugality in consumption, you can think of restrained consumption, either voluntarily, which is what you see increasingly happening in relatively richer parts of the world. But you can also think of frugality in consumption, which is enforced by a lack of income. Frugality in production is more about making things relatively cheap and simple, and at the same time thinking about longer-term sustainability issues like careful resource use, think of what are the environmental implications. And there's also now a lot of discussion around frugality in relation to the so-called Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is about things like the Internet of Things, artificial intelligence, but also more tangible issues like 3D printing, where you could think of printing spare parts for a water tap somewhere in rural Africa or Asia. And the topic for this introduction is to see how frugality thinking can contribute to development studies. In that we distinguish, and that's also what we do in the recently published special issue that Julia mentioned in the EADI, the European Journal of Development Research. We distinguish between two quite different types of frugal innovation manifestations. And these two are often sort of found in quite different articles, in different journals, in different disciplines, in different discourses. The first one is relatively more familiar within development studies. That is the kind of bottom-up frugal innovation, which is sometimes called grassroot innovation, which is discussed a lot under the labels of survival strategies, bricolage, below the radar or informal innovation, where most of the innovation processes have very little to do with R&D laboratories, but are basically community-based attempts to try and innovate in very constrained settings to try and deal with acute challenges at the local level. The other type, what we call the top-down frugal innovation, has become quite a hype in much of the business school literature, which is about a business model to enter the base or the bottom of the pyramid, where relatively large multinational corporations, but also local companies, produce stripped-down versions of higher-end products and services to capture the new middle class and poor consumer markets in the global south. For us as a research center, both these kinds of frugal innovations are of importance, and we look at them in terms of an empirical question of when and where they are more likely to contribute to inclusion, sustainability, and development. Kind of an attempt at a sort of a definition, which is a bit of a moving target in an area of work which is sort of now quickly expanding, is the design of affordable product services systems with what we call low user complexity, high functionality, and high user value for relatively low income people. These can be produced by businesses or by communities themselves, can be as a commercial proposition or to address local constraints. And important to mention is that for us, frugality is not 0 or 1. Things are not fully frugal or not, but many things have some sort of frugal dimensions to them. I will give a couple of examples in the next slide. First of all, something about the link with the development, introductory type. There's a strong parallel for those familiar with the sort of development studies discourse on the sort of distinctions and complementarities between the formal and the informal economy. There is a strong parallel here with top-down versus bottom-up frugal innovation. So we talk about duality, segmentation, exploitation, possibly about adverse incorporation and isolation and exclusion. And we look at situations where there is more likelihood that combining top-down and bottom-up innovations would actually lead to more developmental, inclusive, sustainable outcomes. In that, there is still a very important role for trust, social capital, embeddedness with respect for different kinds of knowledges in finding more inclusive and sustainable pathways. Now, some examples of top-down frugal innovations, like the nano car at the top in the middle. For example, at the left bottom, you see M-Pesa, mobile money provider, which is also a very popular and often used example. And at the right top, you see, for example, a cheap mobile heart rate diagnostics medical device, which sort of costs 5% of what such a device in a modern hospital would cost. And it has sort of 80 or 90% of the functionality. This is sort of an in-between case. If you look carefully, top left, you see the solar-based mini grids of solar-based energies at local level, here in this case in Nepal. Examples of bottom-up frugal innovation, like the relatively famous, at least in India, walnut cracker that we see on the right. And a typical example also on the left, in this case from Vietnam, of using, reusing, and readjusting existing machinery and technologies for innovative uses. An example of something that is already quite a mix, in a sense, of top-down and bottom-up frugal innovation is an example from India, Miticool, which is a refrigerator without using no electricity, or doesn't require electricity. It's based on different levels of clay with water and air circulating between these layers of clay. It was developed in India in a rural setting after an earthquake, when there was a blackout of electricity. But as you can see in the next slide, this product is now also being developed and sold in a much more sort of high-end version, and is on sale at Alibaba.com. And the producers at local level and the entrepreneur that developed the Miticool originally have been able to develop this product now into something that also has become a bit of a hype product in upper middle class households in urban India. For us, a big question is, with this bottom-up and top-down frugal innovation, is where and when you can make connections that actually make sense for people. We call this polycentric innovation. This only works if you have what we call a two-way street, where learning, absorption, and respect is not only going from the formal to the informal, or from the top down to the bottom up, but is actually a two-way street. This sounds easier than it is, because most of our trained engineers and laboratory experts look down upon indigenous knowledges and local ways of trying to innovatively deal with local challenges, while for a conducive way of actually mixing these kinds of innovation, you need a sense of mutual respect, and we need also then to build trust in the system of these interactions and in the institutions that make these interactions more likely to happen. Because we all know in development studies that unregulated market exchange is likely to be or become exploitative. Now, my final slide, looking ahead, I will take a few more minutes to deal with that, because I guess I'm doing quite well in terms of timing. Yeah. First of all, the very important point made by Professor Carlota Perez about the impact of the fourth industrial revolution being unique in the history of mankind, in the sense that we are now aware that we are in the midst of an industrial revolution while we are undergoing it. And her point is that in earlier industrial revolutions, if you think of the invention of electricity, of the mass consumption, mass production, conveyor belt systems. It was only after the fact that people realized that the world had really changed. Now, because we are sort of closer in the curve now and are better able to actually see what is happening, we also have a policy choice of whether we are going to intervene and how to intervene to the benefit of those who are more marginalized and less likely to be included on their without further policy assistance. So, I mentioned already polycentric innovation as a two-way street from formal to informal, but also from informal to formal, the need to build trust in the system and in institutions. And the final point is that while unregulated market exchange is likely to become exploitative, it is also important to avoid romanticism about local innovations and to not try for these kinds of processes to think too romantically about, for example, Gandhian production methods or the school of appropriate technology, but to see how we can find ways in which, while recognizing that these new technologies are going to change much of what we know in the practice of development, but also more broadly in global development, that the frugality lens would be one lens to try and see how we can make use of these opportunities while being very much aware that unregulated market exchange is probably going to make things only worse and lead to more and more inequalities. I think that's what I wanted to say in terms of the introduction. Let's see if I can. Yeah, I can invite maybe Julia to invite all of us to start the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Peter, for this very concise introduction and an overview. And I think there are quite a lot of questions that we can discuss now. Yeah, please, if anyone has a comment or has a question, please come forward. While I give you a few moments to think, maybe I can take advantage of my position and ask the first question.
Of course, yeah, sure. Would you like me, by the way, to keep the shared screen?
Yeah, well, I mean, you can keep it open in case
Okay.
You may want to refer back to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, makes sense, maybe. Yeah, I was wondering whether you consider the frugal innovation as a transformation discourse, and if so, how you position it in relation to, for example, voir vivre or degrowth discussion. Particularly, well, when we talk about invention, adaptation, the engagement with local knowledges, and on the other hand, of course, the danger of appropriation of technology.
Yeah, yeah. Well, there are two answers to that. One is that we have only relatively recently sort of started to engage with people in the degrowth community, but that is potentially a very fruitful and interesting. There's a very interesting parallel and interesting to explore interfaces between these discussions. In the sense that the degrowth literature has this sort of connotation of being, let's say, not very inviting to looking at new technologies, but being very clear about the disharmony and the disequilibrium, both at local and global level, in the way that we have in the last 50 years or so dealt with using technologies and exploiting the earth, etc. What we would like to explore with that degrowth community is to see to what extent you can actually bring some of these new technologies in to strengthen the logic and the attractiveness of a degrowth scenario. I think more and more people are increasingly convinced that business as usual or growth as usual is not possible anymore. But the question is, what is the alternative and how do we get there? For us, a frugality lens would be one of the ways to try and look at such a transition pathway. And that could be about frugality in consumption. And it would definitely also be about frugality in different kinds of production settings. On the consumption side, this is a difficult to sell story. There is, of course, the voluntary restraint and frugality among certain groups of consumers. But there is also an enormously large group of new middle-class consumers at the global level in countries like China, India, Brazil, South Africa, Nigeria, etc., who are not necessarily inclined to take responsibility for saving the earth at this stage, in the sense that because others have sort of messed things up initially, and now it's their turn to enjoy a color television and an iPhone, etc. So it's a very difficult discourse to try and discourage them to also move into that kind of consumption patterns. But nevertheless, it is very important that we try and open up that box of finding a way that these new middle-class consumers are not going to make the same mistakes that the previous generation has made, even though, of course, they are fully entitled to similar consumption practices if they so desire. So it's a matter of a mental shift that is required. And there also frugality thinking might become quite important.
Okay, thanks. I see two questions. First, Dennis, and then Joy. I think we cannot hear you, Dennis. No, unfortunately not.
I don't hear anything.
No. Well, maybe then we take Joy first. Joy? Gone?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I also don't have very much voice, which Peter probably thinks is actually a very good thing, no doubt. Peter, I enjoyed what you had to say. I have two, well, one was more as a question, which relates really to changing institutions. Because I see that you had got something about respect on one of your slides. And I'm thinking that a lot of people who practice in sort of frugal innovation would actually be in the informal sector. Mm-hmm. And government, state institutions are not overly enthusiastic about the informal sector for a whole range of reasons. In fact, Rwanda is the classic case of this, in which the informal sector has been legislated out of existence. It still exists, but in a very precarious way. So I'm thinking about how do we get institutions also to change their mindset. I'm also thinking of a PhD student I have at the moment who's looking at universities and community practice in Africa, and how that the universities, particularly say in Ghana and Tanzania, are rooted in a discourse of Nyeri and Nkrumah, who saw African universities in a very different way of serving Africa from an African way of doing things. But when you look at what the way they are behaving, the universities behave just like European universities do. So I'm wondering about, you know, that kind of that type of transformation. And just a small aside linked to your comment about the middle classes. I think there's something actually quite interesting going on in India at the moment, in that there's been a campaign which I think is called Give It Up. I'm not quite sure, I'd have to look at what the proper title is, but this links to LPG. And so that to allow poor households, I know this is not quite the same thing as frugal innovation, but there, you know, the I would say that the middle classes are not completely a lost cause. And certainly in India, there's a sufficiently large number of people who have been prepared to give up using LPG, so that lower income households can have access to this and to cook in a clean way. So that's my observation.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Joy. Let me start with the last one. That's relatively easier, perhaps. I fully agree that the present middle class is not a completely lost cause. Thank God it isn't, because much of the really urgent need for change and, let's say, what some people would call the green transformation at the global level as well as at the local and national levels has to come from the new generations, for whom being middle class is not a given, but is a relatively new phenomenon. So yes, I also see different sorts of examples. For example, in Kenya and in South Africa and Brazil, often these are, at one level, they are relatively sizable groups in terms of committed young people in relation to the other youngsters in their own environment. But if you then look at the extent to which these groups are significant in terms of numbers for the total population, then unfortunately I think we have to say that these are still relatively small pockets of very promising trends in terms of give it up, whatever that might mean in a particular case. But in this case, we could translate that as sort of giving up conspicuous consumption, or giving up using non-renewable energy sources, or and that kind of giving it up for a common future is something that we clearly need much more of. Then the tough question on the respect for frugal operators in the informal sector. That indeed is also, in our experience, quite difficult, because, as you say, even though, for example, in countries like Ghana and Tanzania, they might officially refer to their own heroes, in most of the sort of natural science and innovation management faculties, also in Africa, they operate the same kind of logic as universities in Europe and in the US. And they often are quite disrespectful and dismissive of the indigenous knowledges in the informal sectors around the corner. And they're much more interested in the latest, newest high-tech invention that may come from China, and adopt and adjust that. It reminds me of a presentation that I did some time back on frugal innovation for the African ambassadors to the EU in Brussels. A very interesting group of people, obviously. And I made a comment about the need for looking at knowledges more, sort of the knowledges that countries have in their own informal sectors and that are around the corner, and not only look at laboratory R&D, high-tech know-how and inventions at the global level. And then the ambassador of South Africa stood up and he said that this was not good advice, that it was typical for somebody from the Netherlands, a white guy, to say something like this, because African universities and science and technology institutions also had a right to do their own high-tech, high-end research and development. And of course, I agreed with that point. And then later, after the meeting, this gentleman came to me and he said, well, of course, you are right that we should pay much more attention to our informal sectors, etc. But I had to make a politically correct statement to make sure that you would not, that nobody would leave the meeting thinking that African universities would be forced to be involved only in applied research and not in sort of fundamental R&D, because that would sound, that would sound neo-colonial in a political sense, even though maybe from a more practical perspective, there could be more benefits coming out of such an approach. So I think indeed these issues of how do you look at different kinds of knowledges and whether or not there is a respect to ways of these different kinds of knowledges is a major bottleneck. And we are in the phase of starting up a few projects where we're going to try and tease out how it might be possible to actually overcome some of that disrespect and dismissiveness between these different kinds of knowledge communities. I think I'll stop there, Julia.
Okay, thanks. Then Dennis, if you want to give it another try now.
Sure. How about now? Do you hear me?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, sure. Well, thank you very much, Julia, for facilitating this webinar, and of course to Professor Knorringa for the concise and clear presentation. Professor Knorringa, I would like for you to perhaps maybe if you can expand a bit on polycentric innovation that you mentioned, particularly in terms of if you have any examples about the successful innovation, polycentric innovation, particularly focusing on the patterns that you've observed within these successes, right? Because one finds it very difficult in terms of achieving the two-way innovation, right? From top down and the other way, bottom up, right? Usually it's either top down or bottom up. And then in the private sector, usually you have the intermediate technologies that are sort of being adopted, and the indigenous ones or the bottom up are just chuffed. So if you can please expand a bit on that. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Okay, thanks Dennis for that question. Please call me Peter. That is so much easier than my complicated surname for everybody. That indeed is a very difficult and important question. I use the example of Mythicool in my presentation because if you look at the details there, it is an innovation that very much actually started at the local bottom-up level. And there are now signals and stories at least, but we haven't done any proper academic research on this as yet, that these local innovators have also been able to actually make the step towards things like, for example, patenting, for example, new, better technological elements added to the design, and doing the branding and the logistics in a professional, international manner. And I talked about that very briefly, just with the example of if you go online on Alibaba, you just type in Mythicool and you can get 3 or 4 different versions that will be delivered on your doorstep within, I think, 48 hours anywhere in the world. So that means that this is a major, even though of course small, but a clear success story where polycentric innovation is happening. Of course, if you have only 1 or 2 examples, you have to be modest in terms of making too grand claims on where and when this is possible. There is also ongoing research in the sphere of these what you would call the solar power based decentralized water and electricity systems, where we see a lot of local entrepreneurs taking up quite important roles in the delivery models of these innovations. But of course, you're absolutely right that if you leave things just to sort of develop in the way that they would without any regulatory or other kinds of interventions, what is most likely to happen is that this will lead only to more inequalities, and that the knowledges that are brought in by the bottom-up participants in these kind of polycentric innovation processes are the ones who would least benefit and would be squeezed out along the way. So that's also why I ended my presentation with warning for a new kind of romanticism, because we see also quite some literature emerging, especially in the sort of business school journals, on that the top-down frugal innovations or base of the pyramid kind of innovations would more or less automatically lead to win-win-win situations. This is something where we would like to make a clear stand that we don't believe that this will happen. But at the same time, we don't want to throw away the baby with the bathwater, because we do believe that where there are these possibilities for more respectful interactions, and one takes these opportunities, that mutually beneficial outcomes are to some extent possible, and that it is worthwhile to strive for learning from these good experiences and then trying to find ways to not replicate them, but to learn the lessons from these kinds of experiences. So that's a very long answer, also saying that I don't have that many good examples as yet, but that we are sort of in the process of developing research projects where things that have potential in that sense are to be researched. And if there's one thing that I would like all the participants to perhaps, for the seminar here, to let me know if they think that they have seen or are involved in such examples, to get in touch with us, because we would be very interested to sort of critically scrutinize these examples to see whether the polycentric dimension actually comes to fruition. Thank you.
Yeah, if anyone has any examples, yeah, please write to me, and I'll be happy to pass it on to Peter. Or of course, you can get in touch directly. There was Goran. I think you had your hand up. If you want to go next.
Hi everybody. Thanks Julia. Thanks Peter for this nice webinar. I believe you can hear me, right?
Yes, I can hear you. Yes, Goran.
Yeah, fantastic. So I have a very much applied question. So I'm not from social sciences, development studies, or whatever. I'm pretty much from technology, and I'm a PhD student still. And I'm doing a research on process engineering of a bamboo-based composite, and this all happens in the context of a let's say a relatively low-tech environment. So we are dealing with an East African environment in southern Ethiopia, and yeah, it is more or less what you said before. We are doing the main part of the work at University Hamburg as well as at Fraunhofer in Germany. So it's pretty much a Eurocentric or even Germanocentric project, although it could be developed into that polycentric direction. So the problem that I'm facing, I'm the main driver in this project, I would say. The problem that I'm facing here is that many of these things that you mentioned, let's say indigenous knowledge or informal sectors and so on, which do exist, but not focusing on a high value product as the one that we are developing. All these things are very, very hard to implement into our or into my personal thesis. So I'm having pretty much trouble to satisfy the, let's say, the scientific requirements of my doctoral advisors. On the other hand, of our donations, of our donator agencies and our partners, even our African partners, especially our African partners, actually. Coming back to the example of the ambassador, fits very well what I faced as well, on a lower political level. But what would be your advice? How can I actually try to implement that into my study without risking the whole PhD, let's say, because there is a certain part of logistics and economic model in the study as well. It's quite a large part of the study, in which I could implement it, in which I could do a comparative study out of it. For example, central processing, decentral processing, and so on. But it's hard to have a let's say, kind of scientific base on which I can stand, you know?
Wow, that's a very difficult one, because in a sense you are facing the consequences of that these come from quite different worlds in terms of your PhD is sort of embedded in a top-down scientific model that emphasizes indeed certain universality rules, and that is looking for things that fit with the knowledge as it exists. Well, it's very difficult in that context to pick up a particular sort of element of indigenous know-how and to treat that according to the same rules and indicators and assessment tools, and expect that it will actually perform in that completely alien setting. So I very much recognize this idea that it's hard for you to implement that in your thesis. The only thing I could offer, because I really feel that this would be an important potential thing to actually contribute to, is to talk to your supervisors and to try and convince them of the importance and relevance of creating a bit of space for that other dimension that doesn't seem to fit very smoothly. The other thing I could do is to put you in touch with an Indian colleague of mine, Professor Saradindu Baduri, who is based at JNU in New Delhi. He has done quite some work on how one might actually look at these different kinds of scientific discourses, and how you could have something separately that could still also be at least partly integrated to be implemented in an overall thesis. Let me also ask you a quick question in between. Is your thesis based on articles or is it a monograph?
It has been a cumulative work at the beginning, but since it got some certain dynamic, we had to change the plan, and I feel much safer now to be able to submit a monography thesis. So I might do articles out of it still, but at the moment it is a monography still.
Okay, because then it is relatively easier, in my experience as a supervisor and as an examiner, for people to accept that there is, let's say, one chapter, for example, that in which you clearly explain that you use there a somewhat different starting logic, but that it is actually, for different reasons, relevant to look at in terms of the bigger picture. Now, getting something like that published separately in a more technological-oriented journal will be very difficult. But it might be interesting actually to try and publish something like that separately in a development studies journal, where there is at the moment an increasing awareness of the importance of also looking at technology, but there's not much of a comprehension about how these technologies actually play into the game. Actually, Joy Clancy, one of the earlier people asking a question, is one of the few people that have sort of combined awareness around technology, energy, and gender in development contexts. Working in a technological university, but not being a technologist herself. So there are people who are trying to make these connections, but you are then sort of a bit out of the mainstream and therefore more vulnerable. And in the situation of being a PhD student, you are already quite vulnerable.
Hallelujah.
Yeah. So, well, I'm not trying to sort of give you a nicer picture than I think it is. I think this is, I mean, you are facing one of the, I think, the downsides of a system that has too much evolved around certain generalizable lines of argumentation, especially in fields like process engineering. I mean, I'm not a technologist myself, but in our Center for Frugal Innovation, as I showed in the first slide, we work together with the Delft University of Technology. And we have people, for example, from civil engineering and from industrial design also in our center. And they are the people that actually also work, for example, with local innovations in India. And they have often great difficulties in getting their own work published in the sort of mainstream journals in their discipline, because they come from it, they come at it from a different angle. Sorry, I can't give you probably a more optimistic advice, but like I said, I would be more than willing to have a shot at talking maybe to your supervisor on explaining the importance of this additional angle for your research.
Yeah, I will take that as a joker. So let me talk to him first, and maybe it takes a while, but I'll come back to that. Thank you.
Okay, good. Most welcome.
Okay, then we have the next Janet. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hello. I'm Janet from Ghent University. Thanks for the presentation and everything. But yeah, just maybe a comment on the last intervention. And I've seen also Professor Peter and his group talking about, or also in the articles about lean manufacturing. So maybe that could be something that can work for you. Yeah, the last participant. That could also be something. Yeah, of course, I'm not an expert on that, but maybe that's the one thing I can recall from your work, Professor. I know that can be helpful for them.
Yeah, that could be a way of looking at it. Yeah, indeed. And the process engineering with these bamboo composites is a very interesting area of experimentation with, let's say, more renewable resource use in relatively low-tech environments. So yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, thanks.
Then we have Hans Christian.
Yeah, can you hear me? Hello. I have a question concerning the relationship on the frugal innovation concept with the whole discourse on technology upgrading, especially because in the technology upgrading discourse, we rather don't talk on below the radar innovation, which frugal innovation mainly is. So really interested on your thoughts on this relationship.
Yeah. I think it is the thing that we discussed earlier. The example from Goran is an example of somebody trying to sort of connect to below the radar innovations and bring in also a technological upgrading perspective. And I think this is indeed something that is not done enough in the technological upgrading literature. Even the sort of, I guess we're talking here about people like Sanjay Alal as one of the founders of this kind of approach. And that they were very much talking about, in those days, about catching up and about jump starting. And there's now also a lot of literature about the role of technological upgrading in China, which is no longer sort of copying, but is actually starting to run ahead of the story of what's happening in the US and in Europe, also in terms of environmentally conscious technological upgrading. But for me, that is very clearly indeed a missing link. I don't know why the people in technological upgrading are so hesitant to engage with below the radar innovations, but maybe Hans Christian, you can say something about that. Where does this hesitation come from?
I'm not sure yet how to answer this, but that's what I'm also thinking right now, because as the concept of frugal innovation is so young, I think it's pretty difficult to tell what the consequences are on technological upgrading right now, and if frugal innovation can be a competitive advantage for a nation. And then I think what you said earlier in your example from the South African ambassador is really interesting, because nobody would want to emphasize that it can in fact be a pathway to a more competitive advantage for a nation, because then you would totally close the door for a high-tech strategy in the future, I think.
Yeah, nobody wants to close any doors in the policy environment around upgrading and science and technology and innovation. But I think there is also a benefit in realizing that your competitive strength, indeed, as you put it, is not at the high-tech end, but may well be at readjusting creatively things at the sort of mid-tech level, but mid-tech with the fourth industrial revolution input. So we're talking about smart devices, like with mobile banking or with predicting rainfall in rural Africa, which is now done with sort of decentralized, very cheap weather stations, where local farmers can read from their SMS text messages the sort of rainfall predictions. So if you bring these sort of new technology dimensions into making mid-tech adaptations, then there is nothing to be ashamed of being in that segment, because that will be, for many years to come, that will be a massive market segment at global level.
Thank you.
So unfortunately, time is running. I would suggest to take the last question now, which would be of EADI, if I pronounce it right. So if you want to go ahead. If you're still there. Hello? Nada?
No?
No? Otherwise, maybe, Konstantin, do you want to ask rather than type? I can see. Oh, okay, you don't have a microphone. Adding another point on ecosystem-based adaptation. We don't know yet what's the point.
Yeah, well, maybe I can then say something about innovation systems. Sorry, there is a new special issue coming up, also in the European Journal of Development Research, so it has an EADI link. And that special issue is about the link between innovation systems and global value chains. And it has a number of papers that focus specifically on innovation systems in developing countries. And it also has quite some attention for these below the radar type of innovations. There's one paper that is not going to be in that special issue, but that will be published soon, also in European Journal of Development Research, but we were a bit too late with submitting it, which actually focuses on the link between these sort of more frugal innovations in innovation systems in global value chains. So if I'm allowed in the last minute to also make a bit of PR for an upcoming article, then I can close with that.
Well, actually now we have we have 3 more minutes, so we can take the other questions.
Okay.
But yeah, I'd be happy to share, of course, also the links to that. We'll put it on the website so everyone interested can access. So one of the questions was, I was wondering about how the concept of frugal innovation manages to recognize intangible, non-material assets, which are crucial for bottom-up community development.
Yeah. Yeah, non-material assets are important. There is, for example, in the Leiden Delft Erasmus Universities, there is also a research center on what they call cultural heritage, which is also about intangible assets and how they might be brought to bear and be used in thinking about a more sustainable future at global and local levels. So I recognize its importance. I must also admit that I have never done much in terms of research or reading on that. So I recognize its importance, but it's not something on which I can make any useful comment. The one thing that I can say is that we have started also to collaborate with historians. And one of the interesting things with historians is that they made us aware of the fact that until the first and the second industrial revolution, the steam engine, etc., most of the manufacturing as well as trading and consumption practices had a very high frugal content, and that this whole idea of this mass production, mass consumption thinking that is depleting the resources of the world at a large scale with large populations is a phenomenon of the last 100 to 150 years. And that there's actually much to learn about how we could have a more sustainable, degrowth, frugal economy at the local as well as global level in the future. But that requires a major multidisciplinary effort to putting all these pieces together. And I think we've only just started doing that.
Okay, thank you. I think we are at the end of the webinar. So thank you very much, Peter, for taking the time to join us for the very interesting presentation, and to everyone, to all the participants for the diverse discussion, I think.
Well, thank you, Julia.
As I said, the EJDR, it was the first issue of 2018. So if you want to read up, it's also, as Peter mentioned, on several empirical articles are included in that issue. So very worth having a look. And also, I want to also make a bit of advertisement for the next working group webinar, which will be on 21st of June. which will be on citizenship in civil society and development. Also very interesting topic. So I hope to see many of you again on 21st of June. Until then, thanks everyone and have a good summer.
Thank you. Thank you, Julia.